101 years ago, our church burned down to the ground. It was December of 1918, and lightning struck the church. This was the second sanctuary of our church on the corner of College and Main. But that church got hit by lightning, and it burned down in 1918. And so for 2 years, our church had to meet across the way at Central, which was, of course, a school, one of the first schools in Broken Arrow. For 2 years, the church met over there. Now, they had to build a new church. So in July of 1919, so that's 100 years ago, July of 1919, the church launched a stewardship campaign to build a new sanctuary. And notice the sign they put on the corner of College and Main, now for a $25,000 church for Broken Arrow. They needed to raise $25,000 to build a brand new church building, a brand new sanctuary. That exorbitant price of $25,000 was what would be needed to build a brand new sanctuary. And so they began to raise money and to dream and to plan. And that building was finally completed on December 12th, 1920. That was our third sanctuary there on the corner of College and Main, starting in 1920. Now, I'd like to think about what it was like for our church 100 years ago. Think about what it was like for this church as they prepared to enter into the 20s. Think about entering into the 20s 100 years ago. World War I had concluded a couple of years earlier. Of course, it wasn't known as World War I. It was known as the Great War, or the war to end all wars, because no one knew that there would be a World War II. So it was simply known as the Great War. The Great War had ended a couple of years before that, and America was at peace, and the doughboys, the World War I soldiers, had come home, and change was in the air as America and Broken Arrow entered the 20s. I'm thinking, what kind of challenges, what kind of opportunities would face the church in the 20s? After all, Broken Arrow, around 1920, was growing. Because in the 10 years from 1910 to 1920, the city of Broken Arrow had grown from 1,500 people to around 2,000 people. The population of Broken Arrow was 2,000 in 1920. Well, we're about to enter the 20s again, this time the 2020s. And as we get ready to enter the 20s for the second time, quite a few things are different. That sanctuary that was completed in 1920 burned in 1982. The sanctuary burned right around Christmas time in 1982. Luckily and fortunately, though, the church had already built a new sanctuary, this one, the one we're sitting in 1976. And the plan was to convert the old sanctuary into classrooms. But that didn't happen when it burned down. And of course, what stands on the corner now is our kids' space building and our sign and some other things. The population of Broken Arrow, it was in the year 1920, it was 2,000 people. Population of Broken Arrow now is a little over 100,000 people, which is 50 times the size it was in 1920. 50 times. I think we have a couple of pictures here. There's Broken Arrow in 1920. There's Broken Arrow today. Quite a change in 100 years. And of course, $25,000 to build a brand new church. You could not build a new church today for $25,000. When we just replaced the heat and air system in our sanctuary earlier this year, just replacing the heat and air here was over $37,000 just to do that. Things cost a little bit more than they cost 100 years ago. But a lot of things really are still the same. A lot of things in Broken Arrow are the same as they were the first time the church entered the 20s. People are still people. People still have families. People still go to work every day. People still go to school every day. People still have hobbies and things that they enjoy. People still have dreams about their future. People still get married. People still have kids. people still grow older, and people still need Jesus. People still desperately need Jesus. And for 116 years, this church, always on this same spot, always here at the corner of College and Main, for 116 years, this church has been a place where people could come to encounter Jesus, to meet Jesus, to learn about Jesus, to begin to serve Jesus, and to tell others about Jesus. Now, in a moment ago, Jody read this passage from the book of Joshua. And I started talking about Joshua last week. Let's put Joshua in context, though, as the whole scope of the people of God. Remember, it starts with Abraham. God saying to this one righteous man, Abraham, who had faith in God, I'm going to give you a whole bunch of descendants, and I'm going to give them land. And he takes Abraham and shows him and says, this is going to be the homeland for your descendants. Well, Abraham has a son, Isaac. Isaac has twin boys, and Jacob ends up being the one that the promise follows, and Jacob has 12 sons, and that family grows to about 70 people. But famine strikes the land of Canaan, and those 70 people move to Egypt as honored guests because of what Joseph has done for the nation of Egypt. But in 430 years, the descendants of Abraham grow to be thousands and thousands of people, but they also grow to be slaves. And the Egyptians put them to hard labor. And we know the story of Exodus, how through Moses' guidance and God's miracles, they leave Egypt, they leave slavery, and they leave through the Red Sea, and they begin to head towards the promised land. But as we talked about last week, when they get there, they send 12 scouts to scout the land out, Joshua being one of them. And 10 of the scouts say, there's no way we can ever occupy this land. The people there are too big, they're too strong, they're too well fortified. They'll kill us. Only Caleb and Joshua, only 2 of the scouts say, we can do it if God is with us. We can take our inheritance if God has told us that we can. But the people are afraid, and the people are fearful, and the people rebel, and the people want to go back to Egypt. And because of their fear and lack of faith, God says, you're going to wander for 40 years. And only your children will enter the promised land. Anyone 20 and over is going to die in the desert, and only the children will enter after 40 years. Only 2 adults will actually go in, Caleb and Joshua. Well, now it's 40 years later. And Joshua has gone from being a young military man and a scout and Moses' apprentice. Now Joshua is the leader. He's in charge. He's the one God has said, I was with Moses, now I'm with you. And Joshua, after these 40 years of wandering, is getting ready to cross the Jordan River with the people of Israel and go into the promised land, go into the land of Canaan, and begin that process of occupying this territory that had been promised to their ancestors 400 years earlier. And God gives Joshua a pep talk, and he says to him, be strong and courageous. Did you notice in the space of 5 verses, God says, be strong and courageous 3 times. Be strong and courageous, be strong and very courageous, be strong and courageous. He ends it up this way, be strong and courageous, don't be afraid, don't be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. God will be with you wherever you go. Now those words, that verse, Joshua 1:9, I think is a good verse, not just for that particular time and moment in history. That's good advice anytime in our lives. Anytime we're getting ready to face something new, the unknown, the unpredictable, a new situation. When you're getting ready to enter a new situation, be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid. Don't be discouraged. And know that God is with us. God never abandons us. God never leaves us. God is with us wherever we go. And that's the story of our lives, because life is always about entering new territories and new situations and new relationships and new everything. I mean, think about it. We go to preschool. That's a whole new thing. Got to share toys, got to meet all these new kids. And then just when you master, coloring and you're numbers and things, then you go to kindergarten. Got that figured out, now you got to go to first grade and on. And then once you get elementary school figured out, there's middle school, and then there's high school, and then either you go to college or you start a job or you get training in a trade or whatever you do next. And life just keeps changing. Maybe you get married. Maybe you have kids. Maybe you start a new job. Maybe you move to a new town. Do you know the average American moves at least 7 times in their life? It's always about new things and new places and new experiences. When I knew that God was calling me to go to seminary, and I decided to go to seminary in Southern California, in Pasadena, I drove I-40. I didn't know a single person in California. And I'd been to California one other time with a choir trip. We'd gone to Disneyland. I discovered California is not all Disneyland. There's more to California than Disneyland. And it was a whole different ballgame. But that's what life is like for all of us. We're always entering into new places and new times and new situations. And that's what we're getting ready to do here in 2 months. We're going to enter a new decade. We're going to enter the 20s. You may say, well, that's just kind of a number. Well, yeah, but all those numbers that end with 0 kind of say a new decade is a new territory. And life's always about new things, and our church is a living thing. We're in our 4th sanctuary, but this church is 116 years old. This church has been here since 1903. It's when, we're the first church in Broken Arrow. We're the oldest church in Broken Arrow. This was the first church in Broken Arrow. And think about how much our church has faced in 116 years. Think about the first time we entered the 20s. The 20s, the 1920s, I was reading a little bit about the history of our church. On Mother's Day, 1922 in our church, in the middle of the worship service on Mother's Day, a delegation of 18 Ku Klux Klan members walked into the church in full white robes and hoods. And then were asked to leave. Luckily they did. That was an interesting Mother's Day. Glad that didn't happen again. But think about all that's happened here across the decades. This church has gone through World War I and World War II and Korea and Vietnam and Desert Storm and on and on. This church has weathered the Great Depression and McCarthyism and flower power and hippies and Watergate and 9/11 and on and on and on. And through it all, this is a place where people have come to meet Jesus. A place where people have come to meet Jesus Christ. And now we're entering a new decade, new territory, and the change in our culture is faster than ever. Even in the 16 and a half years that I've been here, the culture has changed dramatically, and it's going to keep changing, and we're entering what may be one of the most challenging times for American Christianity, the 20s. Just this week, they released some new statistics about Christianity in America. 10 years ago, 2009, the percentage of Americans who identified as Christians was 77%. This year, the new survey, 2019, the percentage is 65%. So the percentage of Americans who identify as Christian has dropped 12% in 10 years. And think about if that trend continues. What does that say about our culture? What does that say about Christianity in America? There's some challenges out there. For example, by generation, of the millennial generation, which is people between the ages of 23 and 38, those who identify as Christian is now down to 49%. The first generation ever where Christianity is the minority for millennials. That's a challenge. That's a challenge. So does it terrify us? Does it discourage us? Well, God has said, don't be terrified. Don't be discouraged. Didn't you hear what he said? He said, don't be discouraged or terrified. Instead, be strong and courageous. In other words, whatever the situation, God's going to go with us. And God's going to allow us to do what we're called to do. We have our work cut out for us as our church and the churches of America. We got our work cut out for us. But here's where it's different from what Joshua faced. Joshua was getting ready to go fight battles. Joshua and his soldiers, they went into the promised land, and the first thing they did was to attack the city of Jericho and conquer it. And it's all about battles in the book of Joshua. They're fighting these Canaanites, Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, all these people that God had judged, and God has said, these people are wicked. They're practicing child sacrifice. They're throwing their babies into the fire. They're having cultic prostitution. And this is the land that's been promised to the children of Abraham. But our mission isn't about warfare. Our mission isn't about battles. Our mission, I believe, as the Church of Jesus Christ, is to spread hope, to spread love, to show compassion and help people to be compassionate, to talk about forgiveness, to talk about reconciliation. If we're going to be fighting anything, we're going to be fighting apathy. We're going to be fighting the terrible loneliness that so many people in our culture feel, the emptiness that is so much a part of our culture, the plague of suicide that continues to rise in our country. We have so much entertainment all around us. Our country's more crowded than it's ever been. There's so much more to watch and listen to than ever, and yet there are so many people who are desperately lonely. When I say the percentage of Americans who consider themselves Christians has dropped, what's replaced it? Not some other religion. It's not like suddenly people are becoming Buddhist or Muslim in big numbers. No, the category that's growing is none. People have no faith, no religion of any kind. People who say, I don't believe in really anything. That's the emptiness that is the plague of our nation. A country that is increasingly saying there's nothing ultimate to believe in anymore. But we know that there is. There is one who is our creator, who is our sustainer, who's our redeemer, who is the God who fashioned us in his own image and breathed into us the breath of life, who made us in his own image. I believe that our church is in a unique place to fulfill the ministry and the mission that we've been given. Now, there's lots of churches in Broken Arrow, and there's lots of churches in Tulsa. Matter of fact, this is one of the most heavily churched cities in America. There's lots of good churches out there, but I think we have some unique gifts to share. There are churches out there, sadly, that are old and dying, that are on life support. There used to be a Presbyterian church catty corner to us. It's not there anymore. It's going to be a restaurant now. Why did it die? Because they didn't have any young people. And they all just died. And they had to close the place down. Because they failed to attract any new people or any young people. The sad truth is that here in the United Methodist Church in Oklahoma, we have close to 500 Methodist churches, but half of them have no one under 18 in their church. Not a single one. Not a single child or teen. Not one. Half of our churches have no young people. That's a recipe for decline and death and hospice care. We're so blessed to have a multi-generational church. There are new churches out there, new, young, trendy churches. I was getting my driver's license renewed a few months back at a strip mall. The strip mall had 3 little new churches in the little strip mall, all non-denominational new startup churches. Went there a few months later and 2 of them were gone. There are brand new churches, but so many of them don't make it because there's no one there with experience or legacy or wisdom to help them to know what to do. Some churches are so small that they can't offer much in terms of ministry. Some churches are so big that people feel like a number and they feel like they're just at a stadium. Some churches are pushing a political agenda instead of pushing a Jesus agenda. Some are pushing a progressive agenda or a conservative agenda. I mean, there's churches out there that are struggling in lots of ways, but, I love our church. Of course I do. I'm a little prejudiced, but we're multi-generational. All generations, young and old. We have so much to offer. We're big enough to offer so much, but we're not so big that we can't know each other, that I'm actually here in person instead of on a screen. We're not so big that we can't know each other. And We're not united by a political agenda. We're united by a Jesus agenda. We're united by our belief that the only real answer to the longings and the hurtings of humanity is Jesus Christ. That what we need is to connect ourselves with God because there's a God-shaped hole in every heart that only He can fill. We're united in the fact that we're all sinners in need of a Savior. We're about to enter this new decade, the 20s, and it's unknown territory. But as we enter unknown territory, don't be terrified, don't be discouraged, because God is with us and we can be strong and courageous.